Please request all of you to please take your seats. We'll start the last plenary session of this conclave very shortly. Request the technical team to all good? Cameras? Are we live? Thank you. With your permission, Chair. Oh, the bells have started. The bells have gone. Now good. So, a very warm good afternoon on this very cold Saturday afternoon. So welcome to the last plenary session of this Global Conclave 2024 on advancing human development in the Global South. This is a roundtable on reflections on future of human development. This roundtable is being chaired by Professor Deepak Nair. He's Chairman, Institute for Human Development, Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and former Vice Chancellor, University of Delhi. Request you to please grace the dais, sir. The panelists in this session are Dr. Ernest Ariety, Secretary General, African Research University Alliance, and former Vice Chancellor, University of Ghana. Request you to kindly grace the dais. Dr. Francisco Ferreira, Professor and Director, International Inequalities Institute, London School of Economics, UK. Request Francisco to please grace the dais. Professor Bhaskar Veera, Professor of Political Economy and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education, Cambridge University, UK. So kindly grace the dais. Dr. Swarnim Wagle, former Vice Chair, National Planning Commission, Government of Nepal, and Member of Parliament, Nepal. You're invited on the dais, please. Dr. Azita Berar, Chair, Board of United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, Geneva, and former Director, ILO Employment Policy Department, Geneva. Request Ms. Berar to please grace the dais.
She'll be back in a moment.
Yes. And Professor Thomas Pogge. He is Director of the Global Justice Program, Leitner Professor of Philosophy, and Professor of Political Science, Yale University, USA. Request Thomas Pogge, sir, to please grace the dais. Request Professor Deepak Nair to please steer the session from here on. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. Good afternoon, colleagues. Our apologies that we are late. I hope the one thing we learned from this is that more is good. More is better, but it's not necessarily always good. And I hope we will establish that less can also be more. The object of this concluding plenary session is to reflect on the future of human development. It is obviously an ambitious exercise, since none of us has a crystal ball, and social scientists are not adept at futurology. Even so, we can engage in some loud thinking about how the future might unfold and where we might be, say, in 2050. Now, in order to make this vast subject into a manageable task, I will attempt to structure our discussion around selected themes that will influence as well as shape outcomes in human development. Now, to list these: growth and inflation, inequality and poverty, education and healthcare, climate change, public action, employment, inclusion, and social protection, and last but not least, rights and freedoms of citizens. Now, each of our distinguished panelists on this roundtable will reflect on the selected theme in their opening statement of 8 minutes. Rates of economic growth and inflation situated in the wider macroeconomic context will shape living standards of people and their well-being. That will be addressed by Professor Ernest Ariety. What happens to inequality and poverty will be a critical determinant of human development outcomes, and that theme will be addressed by Professor Federico Ferreira, climate change is a clear and present danger for humankind, where the poor and the marginalized are the most vulnerable. That theme will be addressed by Professor Bhaskar Veera. Public action on the part of governments and civil society can mitigate the negative and reinforce the positive. This theme will be addressed by Dr. Swarnim Bagle. Employment possibilities, economic inclusion, and social protection will indeed influence human development outcomes, to be addressed by Dr. Azita Berar Awad. Rights and freedoms of citizens are being circumscribed almost everywhere in the world. With the rise of populist authoritarian regimes, where democracy is often at risk, while the surveillance of citizens by governments that began with the pandemic continues and intensifies. Professor Thomas Pogge, education and healthcare, I believe, are both instrumental in and constitutive of human development. And I will take 2 or 3 minutes on that particular theme, okay? Now, in a sense, this plenary session is different from its predecessors. Those were about presentations and discussion. We hope to run this as a conversation. In the roundtable, and with all of you who had the patience to stay with us on day 4 in this auditorium. Now, the opening statements will take a little less than 1 hour. I will set aside the next 30 minutes for discussion among panelists, the conversation, and I hope we will have 45 minutes for questions and answers. Last but not least, I should add that while our focus is on the global south, there are reasons for concern about human development even in industrial societies. As social protection is diluted, education and healthcare are subjected to expenditure cuts, and risk is increasingly privatized. Our panelists in this roundtable and participants from the floor may, if they wish, stretch the geographical space in discussion. And I'd like to point out that our panelists are indeed global. North America, Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia. Everybody here has an engagement with one part of the world or the other, if not the whole world. I'm now going to invite our panelists to make their opening statements in the order that I read out their names. Professor Ernest Arrietty, the floor is yours. You can speak from there.
Okay, I think I'll do that. Thank you very much, Deepak. Thank you for the opportunity to join this conference to discuss human development in the global south, and in particular for this closing session where we focus on the future of human development. As you pointed out, I come from Ghana in Africa. My work basically covers most of Africa. It's on. Okay.
It's back.
It's okay. Thank you very much. My comments are going to focus largely on my experience in Africa, but also taking into account what I've seen happen in the many different parts of the global south. Today, your average African country has a huge debt problem. Your average African country faces some form of debt distress. And why has that become the case? Considering that not too long ago, we went through the HIPIC initiative that saw a lot of relief brought to various countries. Why has that come back? We link that to the changes that have taken place in political governance in the region. So the type of politics that we face is very different from what we did face 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we went through lots and lots of reform. The essence of this particular engagement, where we try to understand how the new politics affects the new economic situation that we have. In very, very simple terms, governments in the region have a new sense of obligation towards their people. There's some kind of a social charter effectively informing governments about the obligations in the area of human development. So as elections have taken place in almost every country, mine especially, governments have always promised to do much better on the human development front. The outcome of that engagement is that human development is pursued using various different instruments, including the macroeconomic policy framework. So the spending by governments is largely towards meeting various social goals. It is not, therefore, surprising that throughout the region, you find a contest of who spends more on social protection or who spends more on the human capital development. In Ghana, which is the country that I know best likely because I live there, we've seen in the past 20 years, every government make very strong promises, commitments towards spending. And we've seen governments fail miserably to mobilize the resources that are required to provide those social services and goods that are being promised. We've seen how from year to year, the difficulty in mobilizing tax revenue has led to much larger than anticipated growth in the deficit, and how the deficit has been funded largely through borrowing from both domestic sources as well as external sources. So we've seen that happen. And it's not surprising, therefore, that today we are back in engagement with the IMF trying to find relief through new debt. What is interesting about this is that in the last 2 decades, governments have sought to meet the requirements for financing a lot of these social items, social protection items, through not only borrowing from domestic sources, but external sources of a different type. Not your usual concessional sources that will come from the bilaterals and the multilateral agencies and so on, but also borrowing from the private markets. So that has happened. If we think about the future of human development, what for me would be of interest would be how do we provide for the things that enhance our capabilities without necessarily going into debt. That has been the challenge that the developing economy has faced over decades. But how do we do it? How do I advise the government of Ghana or the government of Senegal or government of Nigeria to be able to provide education and health, looking for jobs, providing employment in a sustainable manner without incurring new debt? It's a very, very tough thing to pursue. How do you allow the central bank to pursue inflation targeting largely to meet monetary policy obligations? It's another option. But, so is it possible to pursue inflation in a manner that does not create additional problems on the fiscal side? Is it possible to set targets for growth that do not necessarily affect adversely employment creation? These are the challenges that we face. So one of the things I've said to my government from time to time, how much time do I have? What I've said to the government from time to time is, I'm not asking you not to spend money, but spend wisely. And the challenge is, of course, what does spending wisely mean in an economy like ours? It means that you can develop, or you can spend money on new roads, which they do all the time, but be more selective in how you choose those roads. You can spend money on education, you can spend money on health. 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, my government promised to build 100 new hospitals. I mean, does it make sense? Where in the world does anybody build 100 new hospitals? Of course, unless we are redefining what a hospital means. The government 4 years ago pledged to give all senior high school students free education. Does it make any sense? Considering that about 80% of these students in senior high schools were in boarding schools. I mean, I'm sure in India you're very familiar with the boarding schools for the secondary school system. About 80% of secondary schools are in a boarding system. Where in the world do you give kids in a boarding school free education? So it is that call for governments to be a lot more selective in the pursuit of human development that we call for. Is it possible to provide access for poor kids to go to senior high schools in a more targeted manner? Clearly, it is possible. You can simply say that we'll pay for the tuition of these kids in the schools, but they will have to pay for their own feeding. They have to pay for their boarding. There are ways in which governments in the developing world, in the global south, can pursue human development without breaking the bank to do them. And that's what this is about. That's what we preach. So as governments come and say that the academics are putting pressure on them not to spend, we say to them, no, that's not the idea behind what we preach. We say spend wisely. Spend wisely means spend in a manner that you can afford, spend in a manner that is not going to break the bank, spend in a manner that is not going to send us to the IMF every 4 or 5 years. That's what it's about. And I do hope that in our discussions, we're able to find more concrete examples of how this can be done in many countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. Professor Francisco Ferreira on inequality and poverty.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me actually start. I cannot resist to start by saying that I'm very honored not only to be in this closing panel, but to speak after Professor Arrietty. I had once in my career the opportunity to briefly serve as World Bank Chief Economist for the Africa region. And I can tell you that you cannot overstate the importance of Professor Arrietty to the economics profession in Africa. So I'm very honored to follow him here. And I think that it's very important to bear in mind these macroeconomic concerns and constraints that he has raised. Turning to my own remit on inequality and poverty, I want to make 3 points in the 8 minutes that I have. The first one is about is something that's not new to anyone here in this room, which is the extent and nature of the challenge of inequality, and then I'll come to its consequences to human development at the end. But so inequalities in the world are multifaceted, staggering, and overlapping, right? It's not just one inequality. It's inequality in income, inequality in wealth, inequality in health, inequality in education, and importantly, inequality in agency and the ability to live a full life in society and to influence our communities. Just a few very brief numbers. The UBS Global Wealth Report, which is a source I particularly trust on wealth inequality, tells us that in 2023, 1% of the world's population held 44.5% of the wealth in the world, just the 1% at the top. Life expectancy has been improving in most countries in the world, but it still ranges from about 52 years in Chad and Nigeria to about 84 in Japan and 85 in Hong Kong, so from 50 to 85. Education, In 2016, which is the last year for which I could find the number, 1 billion people of the 7.5 billion in the planet were still illiterate, despite huge progress. So the extent of these inequalities is large, and it's not only global. Behind these country numbers that I've given you, of course, there are huge inequalities within countries. Life expectancy for the Adivasis in Jharkhand is very different from life expectancy in the center of Delhi or Mumbai, and so is educational attainment. There are huge differences between races in my country, in Brazil, and between the indigenous and the non-indigenous in Bolivia. And you could go on and on and on, right? So there are these huge inequalities. They are in many dimensions, and they overlap. They typically interact. People who have fewer of one thing very often have fewer of the other as well, right? In terms of trends, I mentioned already before in this conference that the question of trends is a little more nuanced than people often think. It's not true that relative inequality is rising everywhere. It's rising in many, many places, but it's also fallen in some places, including in Latin America, in parts of Africa, in parts of Asia. But absolute inequalities, and I want to make this point quite clearly here, there's a big difference between absolute inequalities and relative inequalities. Relative inequalities stay the same when people increase by 10% their income, say. So they're sensitive to ratios. If you take a measure of inequality that's absolute, that's sensitive to differences rather than ratios, those are growing everywhere, pretty much. Okay? So that's point one. Inequality is not a trivial problem. It's of staggering magnitude. You already knew that. My second point is that looking forward, right, as Professor Nayar said, we're not very good at futurology, but if you try to look forward, how will inequality interact with some of the other mega trends that are taking place in the world today? And I want to mention three of them: technological change, concentration of market power, and climate change. And on technological change, again, the picture is a little bit mixed. But for developed countries, for richer countries, the evidence we have so far suggests that the various dimensions of technological change, beginning in the 1980s with computerization, and then moving on to mechanization, digitalization, AI, whatever name you give it, these various forms of technical change, these various waves of what some people call the third industrial revolution, have typically been complementary to skilled labor, but substitutive of labor in the middle of the distribution, particularly people working in routine tasks, as we know from the work of David Autor and others. And they tend to empty the middle of the wage distribution and move tasks and people towards either the top or the bottom of the distribution. So they are unequalizing in that sense. Whether that's the case in countries like India or even Brazil and Mexico is less clear, because the nature of our occupational distribution is different. And so I think more research is needed on that. But although technological change has contributed to greatly increased prosperity in many places, it's not clear that it helps with inequality. And in many parts of the world, it probably harms. Concentration of market power is even less ambiguous and clearer that there is a trend in concentration of market power, and that is bad for inequality. And that concentration of market power takes place in product markets with, the so-called superstar firms, the Amazons and the Apples and the Metas and whatever you call them, but also in the labor market. So in one of the panels in this session, someone was talking about the power of the buying multinationals who come to buy garments in Bangladesh. And that's an increase in, the producers are not a cartel. They're not, there is competition in production, but there's much less competition in consumption, in the buying of these goods. So, across these supply chains or value chains or whatever you call them, there are many bottlenecks where there is real power, market power, monopoly power, which is both inefficient and inequitable. Okay. Third, climate change. So climate change, I think, again, climate change is the huge elephant in the room. It's, I work on inequality all the time, but if you ask me, is there one topic that's more pressing for humanity today than inequality, I would say it's climate change. But the two interact again in a perverse way, because basically what climate change does is it increases risk. It creates new shocks. It requires change. And the rich, either across countries or within countries, are better able to adapt to these changes and to insure against these risks than are the poor. And you see that everywhere. So turning to my third and final point, and attempting to provide some sort of answer to the question that was put to me, what are the implications of inequality? And to stay within time, I haven't talked that much about poverty, but what are the implications of inequality for growth and human flourishing, which is how I'm understanding here the term human development. And there I want to say these large, overlapping, intertwined kinds of inequalities that are interacting dangerously with climate change and with market structures and with technological change, they do matter for human development in at least three ways, in my view. One is intrinsic. We've already talked about this as well in some sessions here. Human flourishing, the capacity to live fulfilling lives, as Amartya Sen would spoken of it, require a sense of sharing in the participation in community and society, and perhaps even globally. And people value equity and justice, and there is a lot of evidence, very hard-nosed evidence for, narrow-minded economists like myself, to convince us from experiments, from surveys and so on, that people are less happy if there is very large inequality, particularly inequality of opportunity, as I had occasion to mention in my first talk, but inequality in general. So it matters intrinsically. It also matters instrumentally in two ways. And the first one, again, macroeconomists will speak of this in the following language. They'll say, when capital markets, particularly credit markets, but capital markets in general are imperfect, then if there is wealth inequality, that may lead to a misallocation of capital or investment, which is inefficient and can lead to lower growth. Now let me translate that to an example that I like to give. If you think of an Adivasi mother in Chhattisgarh, or the mother of somebody in a slum in Rio where I used to teach, who has a brilliant daughter. The daughter is just really clever, and she can tell that. And if this daughter had access to the best education she could have and the best university she could have, she could be a brilliant doctor or brain surgeon or architect or engineer or whatever, possibly even a useless thing like a good economist, but more likely a useful thing like an engineer or someone like that. And yet that person, you cannot, the imperfect capital markets means you cannot go to the bank and say, look, I have a brilliant daughter, can you give me a big loan and I'll put them in the best school? That won't work, right? It won't work because there's no collateral, there's imperfect information, all sorts of things. So this is waste. This is an investment, in this case in human capital, but it could be in other things, which did not take place, which probably had high returns. And in kind of slightly less technical economic language than inefficiency, that inefficiency really is about the waste of human potential, which there is a lot of, and of course, it's directly related to problems of human flourishing. And then my very last point within the last point of implications is the second instrumental nature, or the second instrumental mechanism through which inequality can harm human development is political capture. Economic inequality is associated with political inequality. We also have a lot of evidence for that, from voting rates to campaign financing to what have you. There is a relationship between the distribution of wealth and the distribution of political power, which can lead, quite naturally, to political decisions being taken that are not necessarily optimal for the majority if the interests of the majority are different from the interests of the most powerful. And I think the greatest example we have of that at the moment is the absence of carbon taxation in the world. Climate change, I'll finish with this. Climate change is this huge problem, but there are technical solutions. I mean, it's an externality from using capital. We could create huge taxes on carbon, and those would tax the richer countries more, the richer people more, both in richer and poorer countries, and could generate a huge fund that the UN or the World Bank or whoever could redistribute. There's a technical solution. No one even talks about it because we know politically it's just a non-starter. But it's a non-starter because of inequality of political power, both within countries and between them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Francisco. May I now invite Professor Bhaskar on climate change?
Thank you, Deepak, for your introduction, and also thank you to colleagues at the Institute for Human Development for your invitation to participate in this wonderful conclave. My thanks particularly to the people involved in organizing the event, both front of house, but also behind the scenes. I know how much work goes into making something like this happen, and it's been an extremely stimulating and successful meeting. We're almost at the end. You can look forward to a nice rest this weekend. So congratulations. Congratulations to the Institute for Human Development for the Silver Jubilee, and congratulations to all of you for a very successful conclave. Now, Deepak, to my brief remarks, offering some reflections on the future. And I have to say, I've been really delighted to see the different sessions across the conference and to see how the environment, which I've worked on for the last 3 decades, is now very much part of the dialogue at meetings like this, and not seen as the fringe interest of those who care about pandas and tigers. What is also increasingly apparent is that there is growing and consistent evidence that the structural inequalities that characterize our world are replicated, and in some cases, as Francisco has just mentioned, magnified in the structural injustices associated with environmental change. Its causes in the historical responsibility of those who pollute the environment or degrade nature, its unequal impacts and consequences, and the unequal burdens associated with the steps that are being taken to respond to the challenges before us. But this should not surprise us. Why should the environment be an exception to these structures? There is nothing particularly exceptional about the environment that might suggest that these structural inequalities will not be reflected in how society responds. So while I welcome the increased attention that this issue is getting, whether framed in terms of the inequalities of cause and impact, or the challenges of achieving a just transition, and what all this means for human development, where I am going to be slightly provocative is to say that I don't think we are being bold enough in the way we are thinking about the environment or in its implications for human development. I'd like to suggest that we have adopted pretty much the same tools and conceptual frameworks to address the environment, which is typically treated as an exogenous variable. It's an external force. It acts upon the economic system, and through this, it also acts upon our prospects for human development. So while there is progress in measures like the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index, which pay attention to the moment we are in, the Anthropocene, these don't go far enough. And importantly, and this is where I think we need to think carefully about the future, we might be at risk of constructing a categorical error in the ways in which we are thinking about the environment. For our current focus, which is human development, I'm concerned that our measures of societal progress have not expanded sufficiently to explicitly include what nature and the environment does for human well-being and prosperity, especially for poor people. We haven't reimagined the economic system and our concepts of human development to internalize the role that the environment plays. And in our conceptual models, there is still a clear separation between the economic and social worlds and the natural world, which remains outside. So let me illustrate with a simple example. I'm a regular visitor to Delhi in the winter, and indeed I grew up here, so this is very much home. In recent years, these visits are dominated by conversations about the air quality index, fog and low visibility, and the cold winter mornings. How I feel is impacted by both how my lungs feel, a very physical consequence of the particulate matter in the Delhi air, but also by my mood. When the sun appears, like it did for 2 days, and I can walk in the adjoining Lodi gardens, admiring the flowers and enjoying this lovely city, my sense of well-being, indeed my sense of self, is considerably enhanced. There is an instrumental relationship at work here. Poor air quality impacts my lungs and almost definitely reduces my life expectancy. But there's also a more fundamental constitutive relationship. The environments that I am in contribute to my sense of wellness and my sense of happiness in a much more intrinsic way. It's this intrinsic constitutive relationship that needs to be better integrated into our conceptual thinking, our models of the economy, of well-being, of multidimensional poverty, of human development. Just as Francisco has just mentioned in relation to inequality, the environment matters not just instrumentally, but also intrinsically. So we've been trying to do some work, developing some thinking about what such an integrative account might look like, what it might mean for our measurement and understanding of well-being, poverty, and human development. In our recent work, we addressed the question of whether there is a philosophical and conceptual basis for treating the natural environment as a constituent of well-being and poverty. And we find that both conventional philosophical approaches, such as those that are based on objective lists of the dimensions that constitute the good life, as well as alternative ethical positions, such as those that focus on issues like virtue, duty, moral obligation, leave open the possibility that the environment does play this constitutive role in well-being, well beyond the instrumental contributions. These ideas are reinforced in cultures and settings where people's relationships with nature are not seen through anthropocentric lenses, where you have other regarding ethics which include nature and the environment as part of the moral community. This thinking is also reflected in recent work on the economics of biodiversity, including considerations about the intrinsic value of biodiversity. Biodiversity's existence value, intrinsic worth, is reflected in the sense that we are enriched when we recognize that we are embedded in nature. To detach nature from economics is to imply that we consider ourselves to be external to her. What we need is an economic model not of separation from nature, but one in which the economy is embedded in the biosphere. Now, this type of thinking has important implications for the future and the future of human development. Picking up from the opening plenary and Pedro's call for thinking beyond today, it allows us to pay more attention to the state of the world that we leave behind, to the stock of nature, and not the flows that we derive from it. So we can start to think about beyond today. It also allows us to add in an environmental dimension to multidimensional measures of poverty and development and human development, and we've been trying to work on operationalizing these. And here are some of the developments in things like geospatial data, the roles of machine learning, which are allowing us to construct these hyper-local indices of a considerable potential, because we can couple environmental data with socioeconomic data to generate new indices. We're doing some work with the UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge to explore these ideas. So much of this remains very challenging because we have to reframe our conceptual models and we have to start measuring what we are currently not measuring. As I think Bina pointed out in one of the earlier plenaries, we don't measure things like life satisfaction or happiness in systematic ways, in consistent ways that would allow us to construct globally comparable indices. But those are the questions that confront me when I arrive in Delhi in the middle of the winter. How happy am I feeling when the sun is shining? And surely this is exactly what we should be thinking about when we think about the future of human development.
Thank you very much, Bhaskar. And I'm grateful to all the speakers, none of whom has exceeded 10 minutes. They have been short of 10 minutes. Thank you. Dr. Swarnim Bagle, on public action, both governments and civil society.
Thank you so much, Professor Nair, for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. Also very grateful to Dr. Shiv Kumar and Professor Alak Sharma for encouraging me to participate in this event. Listening to Lord Desai the other day at the opening plenary made me nostalgic. 30 years ago, I was a student at the London School of Economics, and he brought this paper by T.N. Srinivasan, which tried to demolish the whole paradigm of HDE through the HDI, saying this is a redundant index. Everything HDI correlates perfectly with income per capita, so there's very little value addition that this index is. So it's not a new paradigm; it's a reinvention of the wheel. That was the paper exactly 30 years ago, and all the proponents of HD, Amartya Sen is 90 years old, Mahbub al-Haq has long passed away, Meghnad Desai is 84, and I was looking around, and there's very few young folks who've been steeped in the HD tradition, going back to the early days, who are still active. And I was looking at myself, and I felt quite fortunate that I've traversed this 30-year journey. As a student of HD, I produced 2 NHDRs, 2 regional reports, authored 2 global reports, one co-authored, the other one actively engaged. And when I was the vice chairman in the policy realm and in Planning Commission, introduced the first MPI report, which was immediately used to allocate funds in the newly federated country. So, and I've worked as a senior economist at the World Bank, been a chief economic advisor at UNDP. So I've been to all the different places, which in the past used to be seen as rivals, as pushing competing schools of thoughts and all that. So very fortunate now to emerge as a neutral, perhaps a credible arbiter of many of these disputes. So it is from that perspective that I want to comment on the concept, on the measure and the policy applicability of the human development paradigm, right? Now on concept, I can happily declare that there's this very welcome convergence of HD ideas. In the 90s, we struggled a lot in differentiating HD from the then prevailing idea of, oh, this is different from basic needs. So Haq, if you look at Mahbub al-Haq's writing, so this is not basic needs. Basic needs is very paternalistic. It emphasizes commodity possession. HD is, it's a philosophical paradigm. It's very different. Then human resource development, there was a lot of confusion with that, and particularly from the World Bank, right? And HRD was said to be a means into the production process. Human development, very distinct from that. There was even an effort to distinguish the concept of HD from the growth with equity. And there the argument was, well, we are confusing means with ends, right? So from that, now you look at today, and listening to the World Bank gentleman the other day on the human capital index, and the language he used was all about fulfilling potentials of young children, right? The human capital index is all about children, whether children can achieve their full potential, how current health and education outcomes shape the productivity of the next generation. This is HD language from the 1990s. So this convergence of HD ideas, like in the 80s when even Richard Nixon declared that we're all Keynesians now, referring to, again, Desai's sort of battle between the monetarists and the Keynesians, we are all HDites now. I think that's a very welcome, and I can say that from my own lived experience as a person, as a professional. So that's number one. Number two, there's deep policy applicability now of HDI. I've done this myself when in government, and we explained this in some detail at the MPI session yesterday, examples from Bhutan, from Indonesia, from Nepal, and all that. But this was not always so. HDI, as I mentioned earlier, was discredited from the get-go. And then people were trying to burden it with, oh, why don't you add human rights? Why don't you add environment and all that? But there's a happy resolution of all these expectations now. There shall be one HDI, constantly evolved, refined with the times, indicators revisited. You don't see adult literacy rate anymore because the differentiating power of most countries have adult literacy of 80, 90%. So there's no differentiation there. So now we switch to mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling, and we saw in the presentation the other day, that too is beginning to lose its meaning. Same expected years of schooling, yet learning outcomes and labor market outcomes are completely different, right? So should we be now looking for some quality measures of HD rather than quantity. But having said that, the Srinivasan critique addressed, there was this Martin Ravalian critique of functional forms, should it be arithmetic, substitutability between indicators, that has partly been settled with the functional form being geometric in shape, and also this distinction between flows and stock, right? A lot of the distinction was, the dispute was on school enrollment is a flow, literacy was a stock, and how do you interpret life expectancy? All those things have kind of been resolved. And then there was this third critique from insiders like Sakiko Fukudapar and others who said, we've lost the game. World governance indicators should have been very much part of the HD family of indices, yet we ceded that to the World Bank. This was the old critique. But even there, I see colleagues, Pedro, I don't see Pedro here anymore, but let's retain HDI as that flagship thing, but have a dashboard approach, and let's now do other indices. So IHDI, with inequality rising in prominence, let's discount HDI from a lens of inequality, and recently also on the planetary stress or the planetary adjusted HDI, right? So these innovations, I think, are very much welcome. So policy applicability now in funding allocations in intergovernmental transfers in Nepal, I was giving this example, we use HDI. We're beginning to use MPI, and the granularity of the data, the periodicity of the data, becomes frequent. It will be used. And this is going to be exceptionally important to also depoliticize political allocations, right? So through this formula. The third is on the conceptual, right? So capability approach used to be philosophical, sort of vague, but now becoming highly relevant to the kind of crises and issues we're dealing with. Planetary stress, technological upheavals, societal polarization, economic stagnation, geopolitical rivalries, and all that. So we're now talking about agency at the individual level, at the societal level, and even national and global levels, right? So in 1776, Sen's favorite example was capability to appear in public without shame. This is Adam Smith's language. Capability to appear in public without shame, very much a poverty-driven discourse. But now, capability to affiliate, social capital, social capabilities are very much ideas that need to be borrowed to address the kind of challenges that we are in, right? So this is, so both on the concept, on the measure and policy applicability, I think we've evolved, matured, wide acceptance, but we do need to now adapt also, right? So the indicators move from quantity to quality. This overwhelming focus on the deprived, where do the poor live? I think Sita Prabhu mentioned it on the first day. It's middle class in mega cities that is becoming as the new sovereign units. So this will need us to refashion our discourse. More people living in middle income countries, and concepts of vulnerability and inequality now perhaps more important than the concept of poverty, absolute poverty. And on the how, we used to focus a lot on this old socialist sort of redistribution kind of policies, but now, public provisioning of basic services is becoming a new science of delivery. And part of that story, you see it right here in India, unique ID, real-time data collection, co-payments, PPP, and all that. So Brazil, India, China, so from this classical tax and spend kind of pro-HD policies, we are evolving here as well. Now, looking to the future, I think the word polycrisis has been mentioned. So the test of the relevance of the salience of HD as a paradigm will rest on how well we do in answering the new issues, right? So on economic stagnation and jobless recovery, HDR 94 talked about human insecurity, 2020 compact and all that, but these things are changing. Tax bases are weakening. The issue of indebtedness in the 80s was very different, which gave rise to the HD paradigm. But you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Pakistan, you look at Laos PDR, that HD framework should answer those new challenges in a new guise, right? On demographic and technological disruption, HD did a good job in talking about the care economy in a globalized world, but what about gig economy with grandparents, right? This is a new sort of aging society. How will we address that? Routine tasks that are codifiable will go. Demand will increase for high order cognitive skills. So what does that mean for schooling, conventional sort of educational parameters? Role of big tech, etc. will come later. On planetary, climate action needs secure long-term financing, but private incentives are skewed towards short-term capital gains. How are we going to fix this from a HD framework? Big issue on the social polarization and fragmentation, envisioning social protection, right? And finally, the geopolitical fault lines as well. This involves exercise of agency at the national and global level. HDR 2013, that I was part of, took a very positive view of the rise of the South, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, etc. But now with US, China, even India, China contestations, how will this constrain policy choices for lagging economies from the lens of finance, technology adoption, mobility, market opportunities? How will we be able to solve collective action problems like climate, trade, safe use of technologies? And finally, the likelihood of active conflict itself, disrupting hard accrued human development gains. I'll elaborate on these if time allows later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Swarnim. Professor Azita Berar.
Thank you. Let me say that the story of work and employment under this era of globalization, hyper-globalization, characterize it the way you want, is not a kind one, is not an uplifting one. And we have heard lots of dimensions of that discussion in various sessions. The diagnostics are there that in the last 2 decades, globalization under this neoliberal regime has not treated well employment and labor markets. We have very large jobs gap. By the way, jobs gap is the new concept that replaces unemployment and employment. Please use that one. The quality of employment, whichever characteristics you take, informality, wages, and in particular, what we have noticed, the disconnect over a long period, a steady decline in the disconnect between productivity growth and wage growth. And I think that also contributes to the situation of inequalities that we have heard. We also see that the new disruptive technologies, there is a lot of emphasis put on job destruction, but actually what is more concerning is the reproduction of the exploitative nature of work that is implied by AI, and at least in these initial stages. And so the question arises, how can we still rely on work and on employment as a major distributor of income and well-being? The easy answer I can give you, and that I can close the discussion, we need a new paradigm. We need a completely new paradigm, the opposite of the Washington Consensus, and a new set of regimes and rules for multilateral responses, institutions, in a number of key areas. But that not being in the cards in the near future, we have discussed that at length in various unequal power, geopolitical divides, wars, economic policy weaponization, fragmented multilateralism, wars and conflicts. But that being said, let us accept, I want to be optimistic and consider that we are in a paradigmatic flux. The old has not withered completely, but it's not delivering. And there is a consensus that it's not delivering. And the new has not been configured, but you hear from many different corners the quest for a new social contract, a new eco-social contract, as Unrest puts it, and to which I would like to add a new eco-social feminist contract. Now, within this ideational discussion, debates for a new paradigm, paradigms don't change overnight, we all know that. I have discussed in the interest of time with these very broad questions that Professor Nair has asked me to tackle, 4 issues that I really think, for me, are priority issues. First of all, already this has been mentioned by previous speakers, macroeconomic policies determine the policy space, determine a lot more employment outcomes that is determined by direct labor market policies interventions. And if we consider just one aspect of it, the debt crisis, the debt distress, again, 60% of developing countries are near the debt stress as we speak. The remedies that have been proposed, cycles of fiscal consolidation, austerity, that have set back the gains in human development, in social progress. So we have, and not in many countries, those types of remedies have not really led to a sustainable financial stabilization either. So the question is that there is something that is not working in the response. And I want to propose that let us look at the IMF conditionality, which is the framework for not only the IMF loans, but also conditionality for other, right, whether these are from private bankers or from other regional institutions, of providing loans and access to loans. Let us turn it on its head. Let us make, rather than contraction in public spending, increase targeting social spending, human development, the ability, the fiscal space, the policy space for job creation as a conditionality and the accountability framework for additional debt relief or the concessional loans. I leave it at that. The other second issue that I would like to tackle is the issue of industrial policy. And I think that as the global north is rehabilitating, reappropriating its version of industrial policy, we really need to think also in the context of developing economies to rethink respective potentials for industrial policy. It is a must if we really want to have job creation at a scale that meets the needs and aspirations. And I really think that we have to be thinking out of the box about industrial policy, because we are thinking of investment in the care economy, investment in the greening economy, investment in digital transition, investment in environmental transitions that have economic return, but have also very high social return. The third issue that I want to raise is social protection. For the last 2 decades or more, we have had always this title, towards universal social protection. I really think that it is time to say this is the goal, universal social protection. Let us then discuss the various models, their functionality in very different contexts, but let us assume that we will not be able to really tackle inequalities, tackle the non-working population if we do not have a major scheme of universal social protection. I know that there are lots of debates, but lots of progress also. We have to think out of the box. And we have to think of social protection not only in the conventional way of life contingency over a life cycle, all the risks associated with it, but also unpredictable risks. Let us think of social protection as economic stabilizers. I think the COVID pandemic showed that those countries that had those schemes already could easier scale up these types of programs. So rethink social protection and rethink universal social protection. And if I may add just 30 seconds on that, we have been trying to add segmented, fragmented social protection schemes to cater for different sectors, for different activities, for informal economy workers. It is good, but we have now a regime which is absolutely fragmented. It still lacks in terms of coverage. 4 billion people across the world do not have access to one type of social. And there are issues with the monetary value of many of these social protection schemes. So the question is that, can we think of universal social protection that not only caters for the predictable life contingencies, but also for all those crises and for all those compensation mechanisms for just transitions, chief amongst them environmental transition. Fourth issue, and I will finish on time, the youth employment conundrum. I really think that we haven't talked enough, at least in the sessions that I have been, on this issue. And I would like to characterize it but youth employment crisis and not unemployment crisis. And I really think that the statistics are there, whichever measure you take, youth overrepresented in informality, including educated youth overrepresented in working poverty, including educated youth youth, you take the SDG indicator neither in employment nor in education and training, you will find that there is a youth employment crisis. Question of access, but question of wages, overqualified. I think some of you may have listened to the discussion by the industry leaders in this very hall, and they all said there is a huge gap between demand for jobs, the types of jobs that are offered, and huge gaps. I will finish on that there are several global polls that show youth want a job with a sense of purpose. They want a job not because of the earnings, but they also want work and life balance. And on that, I will just add an anecdote about what's happening actually in China, which is the concept of lying flat, lying below, and this is about highly educated youth who are opting out because they do not think that they want to participate in this highly competitive, what they call 996 system, which is to work from 9 a.m., 9 p.m. under very competitive, and then to be continuously indebted because they have to borrow to aspire to the consumption model that are pushed on them. So,
Azita, I have to request you now.
Just finishing. Exactly. So I just want to say that let us look at human agency also in terms of resistance, in terms of coming back with social struggles, social movements, social protests, to make changes that are necessary in this context that I have mentioned. So I will end on that
Thank
note.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Thomas Pogge on rights and freedoms.
Thank you.
Very happy to be here, and my task was to talk on rights and freedoms, and I start with a bit of history. After World War II, the US and its allies sought to avert the international recognition of social, economic, and cultural rights, and they said that really only civil and political rights are genuine human rights. This resulted in much delay and discussion about what the projected covenant would be like, and finally that covenant was split into two halves, with both halves being widely ratified by many countries. More recently, the West has much more successfully pushed for replacing talk of social, economic, and cultural human rights with talk of development goals. And I think that has a fourfold potential significance. The first is that human rights are associated with the idea of moral priority. So compliance with human rights is absolutely mandatory and trumps everything else. That is true for conduct of human agents and in particular of governments, foreign policy, for example. It's also true for national and international institutional arrangements. So we have to arrange our societies, the structuring of our societies, the institutions, the legal system, and so on, in a way that is human rights compliant, fulfills human rights insofar as that's reasonably possible, and we have to do the same with international rules and institutions. This is clearly stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. And of course, among those human rights is Article 25. Everyone is entitled to basically having their basic needs met. So legal systems, business and financial regulations, healthcare, education systems, trade and tax rules, and so on, all of that is supposed to be human rights compliant, and everything else is subordinate to that. Whatever else you may want these institutions to achieve, they must at minimum achieve human rights, or that is the idea behind human rights. Now, goals function quite differently. Goals articulate one concern among many that is to be balanced against many other legitimate concerns that governments might have, and also their international agencies might have. So that's the first difference. Very high priority or absolute trumps versus one concern among many. The second is that human rights demand immediate implementation. If somebody's human rights are violated or unfulfilled, they have to be implemented right away. So if it turns out that a prisoner's human rights are violated, that person needs to be released immediately. Goals suggest a process. We set a goal and we work out a path to get there, and can, in the end, take our sweet time to arrive there. So they don't require, are not associated with the idea of immediacy. The third way in which rights and goals language differ concerns individualism. Human rights are individualistic in the sense that each person has human rights, and what happens to other people is completely irrelevant to whether my human rights are respected and fulfilled. With goals, they are often formulated in a collectivistic way. I've got here one example, which is SDG 1, target number 2, which says by 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion living in poverty according to national definitions. So here the idea is that we achieve a goal or set a goal for a population, and if enough members of that population get to a certain point, then the claim that you might have to get to that point is extinguished. People will just tell you, sorry, we achieved 50% by 2030, and you belong to the other 50%, and we get to you some other time. The fourth way in which rights and goals language differ has to do with what we compare the status quo to. Human rights are a shortfall metric. We compare the status quo to a feasible present state in which human rights are realized as far as possible. So we live now in a world in which billions of people don't have some of their basic needs met. And it's pretty clear that in the vast majority of these cases, that shortfall is avoidable. Nothing else comes into the picture. We compare the status quo to what is reasonably avoidable, to what we could achieve with existing economic, technological, and administrative capabilities. Now, development goals are a progressive metric. We assess how far we've come on a path that starts from some starting point and ends up with full realization. So the end point is more or less the same, but we make relevant now the starting point, and that means that we can put a positive spin on the status quo. We can say that we've come already this far. We are comparing not so much with the state that we want to reach, but more importantly with the state that we've left behind, 2000 in the case of the Millennium Development Goals, or 1990, and 2015 in regard to the SDGs. So, and that makes us immediately feel better. We can say, okay, fine, we are still maybe far away from the destination, but we have come a long way. And here, the worse the previous state is, the starting point, the better we look. So it's a little bit, if you think about it in human rights language, it's a little bit like saying in 1840, yeah, we have slavery in the United States, a lot of people are enslaved, but look how far we've come since 1800, how much less whipping there is, how much less oppressive the institution of slavery is now running. From a human rights point of view, you would say that's neither here nor there. What matters is not how bad things may have been in the past. What matters is how much better they could be in the present. The relevant comparison is always with what is now possible. So, positive spin, which of course governments are exploiting to the hilt. It allows us to benefit from past injustice. We can compare ourselves to a prior state of the world that was much worse. And finally, it also doubles opportunity for data manipulation. There's a good bit of data manipulation going on in tracking the SDGs to make us look good, and now we can not only beautify the status quo a little bit, but we can also make the starting point seem a little bit worse in order to exaggerate the extent to which we've made progress. So much on rights. With regard to freedom, I want to say that there are basically three basic categories of freedom that come into the picture. One is freedom in terms of immediate conduct options that people have as protected, for example, by freedom of movement, of worship, of speech, and expression. Then we want people to be free to shape their own lives, to choose a profession, for example, to envision a life and pursue it in a meaningful way. And finally, we want people to have the freedom to participate in shaping their own environment. So to, alongside others, especially in the political domain, to protect and to shape the world in which they live, the social world in which they live. Now, poverty is a very great handicap in regard to all these three categories of freedom. So if you don't have a minimum of socioeconomic goods, if you don't have proper education, healthcare, food, shelter, clothing, and so on, then you will not be able to enjoy and to exercise these three kinds of freedom. Now, some libertarians believe that the outcomes of exercises of freedom should trump the preservation of freedom. They say that a very skewed distribution of income and wealth and of the things that come with income and wealth is justified if it emerged through free transactions among consenting adults. And that is something that I think we should resist. It's denied in the liberal tradition on the grounds minimally that this would make it impossible for future persons to have a fair chance. Obviously, we heard that from Francesco, for example, already, that, of course, high inequalities emerging in this generation greatly affect the starting positions of people in the next generation, and that means that they would be unfairly deprived of their freedom. Nozick, as a libertarian, gives the defense, and he very unabashedly defends slavery and says slavery is perfectly all right so long as the person has sold him or herself into slavery. But one argument already I gave. A second argument one can give against that is that it would provide perverse incentives to trap people into situations where it will be rational for them to sell themselves into slavery or to make such renunciations of their freedom. For example, people who have severe health problems or something like that, you can entrap them and then demand from them that they give up certain basic rights and liberties and have the state enforce it. So it seems that we should here take the liberal side and we should try to make a distinction between those freedoms, basic freedoms, which are inalienable. And among those, we might count a certain share of the value of the natural resources harvested from this planet. So that's maybe a bit of a radical idea, but the current situation is that the wealth of the planet is being exploited by a very small minority of the human population, the owners of natural resources and some governments, of course. And they do so without giving any kind of compensation to the large majority of humankind who are excluded from the value of those resources. So if we had something like an inalienable right to share in those resources that are taken from the planet, we would have the kind of basic income or social protection floor that others have been calling for. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for that succinct statement on rights and freedoms, which is not always present in those courses on human development. Let me take stock of where we are in terms of time. Now, I did say at the outset that I would say something about education, because given the time available, we did not load it onto one of our panelists, but I will take only 3 minutes and be telegraphic. Now, as I said at the outset, education and healthcare are not only constitutive of, but also instrumental in human development. How are they constitutive? simple enough. Educational opportunities for the illiterate, and there are so many in this world, children and adults are essential, indeed a human right, as we are in the 21st century. For education, to me, imparts a human dignity to the unlettered. Health, of course, is fundamental to human well-being. Why are they instrumental? Education and healthcare are the essential means for creating capabilities among people that would enable them to improve their functionings so as to realize their potential and improve their well-being. And I want to make one last simple point in this context, just as bullets, that in education and healthcare, the importance of the public sphere, the public domain, cannot and must not be minimized. For the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable, public provision of education and healthcare is an imperative, even as governments attempt to rely more and more on private provision. For what we are getting now, even in many poor countries, is education as business and healthcare as business. So it is not simply that it reduces access for the poor, it also tends to worsen the quality of public provision. I will stop there on education and healthcare. We started at 2:35. It's now 10 to 4. So we had 2 hours and 15 minutes. I hope to conclude this in the scheduled time, but I will rework the division of time between the panel and the audience, and we will have half an hour for the panel and half an hour for the audience, if that's acceptable to everybody. Otherwise, I'll reduce the time of the panel. Now, I'm going to set the format. I'm going to invite each panelist to ask one question to any of the other panelists or to the panel as a whole. And as a moderator, I will ask a couple of questions addressed to all the panelists. And I will repeat another round if time allows, okay? Now, let me, if people want time to think through what they want to ask, let me ask my two moderators questions first. Now, for a significant proportion of people, particularly in Africa and South Asia, where most of the poor live, most of the poor in the world live, economic growth, which has been fairly rapid by historical standards, has not translated into meaningful development that has improved human well-being. So that there is a public clamor for equality, opportunities, entitlements, rights. Yet the state appears to have withdrawn progressively, vacating this space for the market. What has happened to the accountability of governments? Is it a crisis of political democracies? It could well be, but not only, because this problem persists even in authoritarian regimes in poor countries. Question 2, why do governments compartmentalize human development as a separate domain which has to be addressed by social policies? Social protection, at best social safety nets, and improved access to public services such as healthcare and education. Economic policies in general and macroeconomic policies in particular exercise a profound influence on human development. Now, they shape the level of employment, the degree of social protection, the provision for healthcare, for education, and just as much as Azita said, industrial policy, trade policy, technology policy exercise an important influence on employment creation, employment growth, employment possibilities. In that case, is it not necessary and desirable? And maybe I have a corollary question for Ernest here, because the objective of balanced budgets and price stability, which is the rationale for responsible macroeconomic management, often becomes an alibi in the context of human development. It is not as if everything that is done to balance budgets or manage price stability is in the interests of the economy at large. Now, the point I'm making is it not necessary and desirable to think of human development as a principal objective, okay, at par with stimulating growth or managing inflation? Once upon a time, full employment was also such an objective. It's long gone. So that, what we do for human development enters into the mainstream of economic policies. So those are my two questions for the panel to ponder on. But may I invite panelists in whatever order they prefer to ask one question? Yes, Thomas?
So I have a question for Ernest, and it is this. We were heavily involved in the T20 process here, part of the G20, when India was president last year. And one of the things that we did was to push very hard for the AU's admission into the G20. So the AU is now the 21st member. And of course, we had nothing to do with the eventual success of that, I think, but at least we pushed and pretended to be part of the process with Jeff Sachs and so on. Anyway, the thing is, now we have Brazil's presidency, and the AU is fully at the table, and I think it would be very important for the AU to get its act together and to give a kind of maiden speech in the G20, use its new role in the G20, and everybody's looking at the AU and saying, what is the first thing that they're going to say? Are they going to come just for the free meals and the frequent flyer miles, or are they really going to have some interesting and important proposal to make or demand to make within the G20? And I'm wondering, what would be your proposal if leaders in Africa asked you for advice? What is the one thing that we should take forward in the Brazilian presidency as the key demand that Africa makes on the structuring of the world economy?
That's a very good question, and the best person to respond to it would be Ernest, but we'll come to that after everybody has asked their one question. Azita.
I would like to ask a question to Professor Poge. There is a political economy and geographic and historic debate around the economic, cultural, social rights versus civic liberties and freedom, in that sense, political freedom and political rights. How do you relate that to the following discussion that has been on the right to development and the geography of support to economic, cultural, social rights first, coming from the global south, the ones who may not have been investing so much on this, and the resistance to this discussion pushing for the primacy of political and civil freedoms is coming from the global north. And I am there reflecting on the discussion in the Human Rights Council. Of course, you noted that. So I wanted to know, how do you bridge those rights, human rights, with the right to development? And how do you look at this tension between the two?
Thank you, Zita. Ernest, and then Francisco. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is for Zita. In your presentation, you made a strong push for universal social protection, which I understand the principle. How different will it be for the earlier attempts we've made indirectly to influence the development of social protection by countries and so on, first with the MDGs and now with the SDGs? In what way, so does it mean that in practice, that the world would take responsibility for the enforcement or the implementation of that in countries? How is that going to work?
Francisco.
So I don't want to overburden Thomas, but I also have a question for him. So I thought your comparison or contrasting between rights and goals, including the Sustainable Development Goals, was very thought-provoking. I never thought of it that way. But I kept feeling it is one of these lawyer versus economist situations where, you know, from my perspective, you were taking, you know, a legal statement or a de jure statement as feasible. Now, you said yourself, you know, you mentioned the words feasible present, and you meant present, and you mentioned reasonably achievable. So my question is just the following. Is it not possible that if you ask the government of Argentina, or of India for that matter, to eradicate poverty according to its domestic lines, to its national poverty lines, today, it is doable, but it would require such a disruption to the structures of the markets and property and who owns what and the flows of income, that it might lead to a situation in the short and even in the medium run, which would be worse than if you had given them, say, 5 years. So the point is, I'm not saying we couldn't be more radical than we're being now, but you know, what is immediate?
Thank you. Bhaskar?
Thanks. If I may ask a question for Ernest, in relation to your focus on debt and spending wisely, I suppose my question is around a new form of debt adjustment or debt relief. It was tried, I think, in the 80s in one or two cases, what people at that time called debt for nature swaps. But I guess there's a sort of new context in which we're talking about, at the same time, this unmanageable burden of debt. We're also talking about how do we pay for the just transitions. Are there ways of thinking about how those might link together?
Thank you. Swarni?
Thank you. My question is to Professor Francisco. I think you mentioned market concentration, and I want to link the role of big tech to this issue. So all these emerging big tech companies in the 20th century used to break them up, right? So AT&T was broken up, Standard Oil was broken up from the antitrust perspective. Now the argument these days is, is their size that is of public value. Therefore, you can't really do that. You can't have 50 Amazons or 100 Ubers, because then you lose that whole advantage on saving on search cost, etc. Kaushik Basu has made this point, similar point as well. So the challenge, therefore, is to think of novel regulations to prevent exorbitant corporate profit accruing to just a handful of individuals, and rather go towards creative modes of distributed shareholding. That's been the argument. Now, do you think this is possible from the perspective of equity, human development, consumer welfare? So new mode of regulation to tame the big giants without breaking them up and losing the public value that they have generated.
Okay, thank you. We have questions addressed to panelists specifically. We've also had some questions from me that have not been addressed to any particular person. Now, the floor is that of the panelists. I will keep quiet and then move to the audience. So who would like to begin? Ernest?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, your question basically was on the fact that the world saw significant improvements in growth the last 2 decades. We saw that, but it didn't translate much into the kind of outcomes we're expecting for the poor and so on. That's very true, but to some extent. We saw in many developing countries poverty levels come down.
Surely, but it was less than proportionate to the growth.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Inequality was
Precisely. And we explained it at the time to be linked to the sources of the growth. In many economies, the growth came from largely new government spending, new government initiatives, and so on. So that's what led to it, and they didn't have much impact. So in most African countries, for example, we saw growth, but we didn't see employment. We saw that happen. And that, of course, did have some impact on poverty, on inequality, and so on. So many of the new efforts being made in terms of pushing for growth, with a lot of emphasis on equitable growth. Growth that is coming from sources that are likely to lead to greater spread of the benefits from that. Employment is a key thing. I do remember clearly that at the time we were coming to the end of the Millennium Development Goals, one of the comments that we used to make very strongly was the fact that unemployment was never an issue under the Millennium Development Goals. We didn't have any targets that were dealing directly with unemployment, and that needed to be taken care of. Today, I'm happy that many more governments are interested, but have not developed the instruments for doing that. So what, in my view, will be extremely important is for governments not to believe that simply by pursuing growth for its own sake, the poverty and inequality challenges will be resolved. They would not be. There's a need for direct action. The problem has always been what form of direct action is essential and is likely to lead to the result that we are looking for. And I was very happy with some of the suggestions being made by Azita in her presentation, except that, yes, these are things that we've talked about in much more so in the last decade, but nobody really has the evidence that it's going to work. You know, so I would like to see where, if we're able to merge some of the work coming from a lot of the micro work being done around, in the area of education, in the area of social protection, in the area of health and so on, it might be possible for us to identify key areas where government spending is likely to lead to the outcomes that we are looking for, that will lead to the greater benefits for all. So that's my response to that one. Thomas wanted to know what my suggestion would be in terms of what the African Union should be doing with its new role within the G20. That took me by a bit of surprise because I had not really thought, it's not an area that I work in mainly, but I know that a number of my colleagues have discussed that. The African Union, for us, it was good that Africa was going to be represented on the G20. Did it have to be the African Union? That was a question that I heard many African political scientists raise. Yes, having Africa at the G20, taking a seat there was important. Was the African Union the most appropriate instrument or institution for doing that? Sometimes we had the impression that people like Jeff Sachs were thinking for the Africans. It was good for him to be able to engage the Africans and discuss the need for Africa to be there, but the choice of the African, but I mean, having said that, do I have a counter institution to propose? No, I don't. But it tells me that it's time that the Africans began discussing internally a lot more how the union should work. The union is not like the European Union. The union is not like any other union. That it's simply a collection of bureaucrats without resources. Resources, not simply money, but also the intellectual resources to, you know. So its mission is quite different from what the average African expects. You know, how do you change that? It's something that must happen within the African region itself. It's something African intellectuals will have to take up. But I don't expect anything significant to occur simply by having representation at a meeting of the G20. The Africans must discuss what they want from the G20, what they want from the world. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Ernest said, Thomas, in response to you, that the inclusion of the African Union into the G20, in my judgment, was not about representation or consultation. It was about a political bargain in terms of the expanding composition. And if Ernest knows the African Union much better, but the little I know suggests that they really haven't a coordinated position on almost anything. So they are not the appropriate institutional medium for that.
now they have an incredible
So they will have to think of it.
incentive to get their act together. Right?
So the African intellectuals have to rise to the occasion and inform the debate.
Yes.
Thank you for pushing it.
Thomas, would you like to go? You have a couple of questions, and then
I'll come to you later.
So on the questions of rights, on the question of rights and goals that Francesco raised, yes, it can be counterproductive. Of course, you can say that if we can do it immediately, but if we do it immediately, then there will be all sorts of disruptions which may make the situation more difficult later on. Now, in one sense, it's easy to answer that. If that's really the case, then, of course, human rights themselves would weigh in on the other side and say we should do it more slowly in order to achieve human rights securely and fully over a particular period of time. But I always also wanted to add that, of course, the resources of the country itself should not be assumed to be the only resources available. So insofar as human rights are underfulfilled now in the world, it's not just the responsibility of the country. So if, let's say, let Malawians take care of Malawi, but rather it is a shared responsibility worldwide to see to it that human rights are fulfilled. In particular because, of course, the fact that we have these enormous inequalities now and the enormous human rights deficits in the world, that fact is a consequence of decades and decades of injustice going back, 300, 400 years. So, and on the question that you raised about the social and economic versus civil and political human rights, I would say that two things to say. The first is that they are really in the same boat in that they are of fundamental importance to human flourishing, both of them, and both of them are such that the extent of their fulfillment or realization is very heavily conditioned by social institutions, both on the national and especially also on the global level. So there's really, the ideology that comes out in the Western downscaling or downranking of social, economic, and cultural human rights is that this is the responsibility of individuals. If people are poor, that's really more or less their fault. It's not something that, we see ourselves at most as assistors or helpers of the poor. But I would say that the extent of poverty, the wide incidence of poverty in the world today, extreme poverty in the world today, is very much a product of institutional arrangements for which we are collectively responsible, supranational global institutional arrangements. The other thing one would say is that I think these human rights are heavily interdependent, so you can't really enjoy your civil and political human rights if you lack fundamental social and economic access to fundamental social and economic goods, and vice versa. You cannot really enjoy the social and economic without the civil and political. So in that sense, they are, in the language of the UN, not maybe exactly indivisible, but something in that direction.
thank you. Francisco, the question to you.
So I'll try to be very brief. The question that was asked about big tech, market concentration and big tech. I mean, one nice thing about these panels is you get to talk about stuff you know nothing about, right? That's both a bad and a good. So I certainly am not a regulation expert, but my sense is that both of the things you said are true. The network externalities nature of these things, of these companies, and the scope, the sort of scales of scope that there are mean that they are, it's hard to break them up. And because it's hard to break them up, and they are kind of quasi-natural monopolies, they need to be regulated very heavily. Not only because of their huge market power, but also because, and this goes to some of Deepak's questions as well, also at the moment because of their political power. I mean, these companies exert political power that in some cases is greater than that of governments, and they're utterly unaccountable, and often the decisions they take affect countries where they are not based and which they have no shareholders of. So they must be regulated, and they must be regulated supranationally. And they must be regulated quite strongly. Of course, the economist in the back of my head is saying, well, don't stifle innovation. Yes, there must be ways in which you try to not stifle innovation, but the costs, the present costs are very high. So I would actually, you know, I'm not always a radical, but I would be quite radical in the regulation of these things, I would think. Trying to very quickly answer some of Deepak's very difficult questions. I'm just also going to try to be a little bit provocative in my answers just for fun. You know, your question about shouldn't human development be central and core and mainstream in economic policy? I absolutely agree. In my lecture earlier, I went through mostly human development policies, but I remember saying this requires policies in all domains, including transportation and so on and so forth. So I completely agree on that. But then you followed that up a little bit by discussing budgets and sort of almost as if fiscal prudence and rigidity were to be should be questioned. Whether, for example, to an inflation goal, there should be added a full employment goal. Perhaps I misunderstood you.
I think, yes, I did not make myself sufficiently clear. What I'm saying is that the rationale for prudent macroeconomic management is always sound. But that rationale sometimes becomes an alibi for not doing something in human development domains, because that's nobody's concern. In fact, the only institution that has a mandate to preserve full employment, Francisco, is the Federal Reserve Bank of the US. To stimulate growth,
bank,
to manage inflation, and to maintain full employment. But somehow those, even the incorporation of the objective of full employment as a fundamental objective of macroeconomic policies would correct for that.
So I think actually we agree mostly, but where I was going to try and be provocative, perhaps unsuccessful, is in saying that one of the things I've always regretted is that we in the left have given fiscal prudence to the right as a thing to hold, whereas we should hold it very strongly. I grew up in Brazil when there was a few 1,000% inflation every year, and let me guarantee to you that the people that hurt was the poor, who had to, whose monthly wages went down dramatically, whereas rich families just put the money in bank accounts with automatic, correction. Look at Argentina now. I'm looking at an Argentine colleague here in the audience. It's just, look, I'm all for expanding the budget of poor countries. Do the carbon tax, I was saying, and let's transfer masses of money to poor governments. Once they have them, let them spend them. Until you have them, don't do something that will ultimately lead to inflation. Inflation is terrible.
By the way, I don't disagree with you for a moment. In fact, I was an integral part of the most drastic fiscal adjustment at a macro level in India in 1991. It was essential. But what I'm saying is quite often in many governments, it becomes an alibi. So we really need to recognize that. That's what I'm saying. Bhaskar.
I think Ernest was going to have a
You were going to answer your question, yes.
Yeah, sure. So the question was whether there were any new ways for dealing with debt distress. I mean, you recall that before HIPC, everybody saw that as the new thing to do that was going to clear the slate for all these highly indebted countries. And soon after that, everything is sort of going to run without any obstructions. Today, we know that as soon as countries reach the completion point, they turn their attention to new borrowing, largely because there were new things to be dealt with. There were new things to be dealt with. That's the nature of development. There will always be new things to be dealt with. So it tells me that thinking that one can more or less legislate the use of debt as an instrument for financing is not going to work. Are there any discussions within Africa itself about how best its debt can be sustained? I haven't seen any. We've talked about this debt for digital swaps. I hear it around me, but I haven't seen a single African government that is involved in any serious discussion of it. What it tells me is that the new cries for debt relief, there will be new multilateral arrangements for discussing debt. It's inevitable. They will take place. There will be new relief, maybe not structured like HIPIC, but there will be new. And after that, there will be a return. So what I want to see is a greater responsibility on the part of countries where they think long term. Look, we are going to get this relief. After we get the relief, what do we do? How do we want to grow so that within 15 years, we don't go back to France and the UK and the World Bank and as well? It's something that must take place in the countries. You know, I was very happy when just before Christmas, the government of Ghana decided to launch a 40-year development plan and asked me to sort of facilitate the discussion. And I said, yes, you cannot predict what's going to happen in 40 years, but I'm happy that you are thinking about 40 years. What kind of framework you need for that is something that has to evolve and be sort of developed from time to time.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and well, Bhaskar, and then Azita, and then I'm going to move to the floor.
Yeah. Deepak, mine is a very brief, provocative response to your first question about economic growth not translating into improved well-being and why isn't there a crisis of accountability. And I think that's really because we're measuring the wrong thing, right? I mean, we're measuring an economy which is disembedded from the planet. So the measured economic growth is not adjusted for the profound depreciation of natural capital that is taking place at the same time. So just when we talk about the increase in measured GDP, we're also talking about things like the Living Planet Index and the Planetary Boundaries Framework telling us that we're living on a planet which is unlivable. We haven't internalized that into our economic model. So our measure of prosperity at a macroeconomic level is incorrect. If you measure inclusive wealth, you would actually find that many of those measured GDP growth increases are actually depreciating the future stock of natural capital that we're leaving to the next generation. And that is undermining their capabilities in terms of being able to grow in the future. So my response is that, yes, of course, measured GDP tells us we're doing really well, but actually, are the residents of Delhi doing really well when their lungs are suffering in the face of all this prosperity?
It's, in a sense, for the people, it's a double whammy.
Yeah.
That you get sort of material GDP growth, it doesn't translate into poverty reduction. At the same time, their quality of life deteriorates because the environment is being degraded.
And I think we do have to keep going back by saying, let's keep working on those new measures and let's not marginalize them.
Yeah. Azita, your response to Ernest, and I must go to the floor.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. First of all, Deepak, to your second question, fully agree with you. We should not name employment policy social policy, but at the same time, employment matters very much, demand side, supply side, and what we do with education skills as much as trade, industrial strategy, etc. So I really think that what we aimed at is to call it the central goal, a central goal of economic strategies, and this has to be regained. It was there after 1944. And you mentioned that central bankers, US central bankers, has employment and inflation targeting. But a rise in interest rates in US increases the debt burden in Egypt through devaluation. And they cannot target employment. And I will just end with a short anecdote on this. When the Arab uprising happened in Tunisia first, the former managing director of IMF, in a conversation with ILO, mentioned that we have just 2 months ago, there was an IMF mission, and we did analysis, full analysis on the financial health in Tunisia. 2 months later, eruption, social eruption, he said we erred because we didn't have in our analysis and monitoring any indicators of labor market. So he said, let us sit together and develop something that we will add to our financial health assessment. We did set that, but it has not been used since then. Just to give you an anecdote and why they this kind of conversation took place because there was this Arab youth uprising. If I may answer a question by Professor Arieti very quickly. Professor Arieti, we have the social insurance schemes linked to work status, to regular standard type of work status. We have a range of social assistance, poverty alleviation strategies. We have programs, including in Ghana, on schemes to increase coverage of the informal economy. So there are multiple fragmented. Some are contributory and should remain contributory, and some have to be tax-based. And I would like very much in a future conversation to hear from Francisco what he thinks of taxation as a matter of reducing
if
inequalities.
time allows at the end. I think the audience has top priority. The gentleman here on the left, and the one behind you, Jerry, you, sir, and you, in that order. That's 5, 6, all right. So we take the questions, but I have one request. No comments, questions, please. So we'll get the responses from the panelists. Yeah.
Living Planet Index, Baskerville. He put it succinctly, compellingly, as against Thomas Pogge itself. So is it really a question as to worry about human dignity and planetary dignity, if I may coin the term, into embedding it as a common denominator in everything the systems are created by the economists or otherwise? Question number one. Question two, to a good friend from Ghana, did I get it right? Enes, welcome to India, first of all. And my question is...
Question, please.
I'm getting to it. Give me 10 seconds, please. That's our cultural heritage, right? Welcome. Now, I've been part of the OAU and the US-Africa summits for 5 of them intimately, so I do know. Isn't it time to get the act together? And if that is not the time, then when is the time? As a secondary to that, Africa is a great, great continent and a country as a whole, if I can say so. What are those 3 things, top things, that you would recommend, you personally, because you have the responsibility, not associating with G20 as a whole? Thank you.
Yes.
Hello, my question is to Professor Francisco. Since it is about the human development, SDGs are pretty much the globally recognizable framework for the human development, and the national development plans are tied to the SDGs. But within SDGs, SDG 10, there are no indicators which certainly measures the inequality which you talked about, the health inequality, the educational inequality, and the intersectional inequalities which appears among the historical disadvantaged group. So what framework can we propose? Since you are from the Brazil, and the Brazilian G20 presidency has taken up inequality as the technical inequality as the priority of their G20 presidency. So what framework can be made up which can incorporate the intersection of the inequalities and the inequalities related to health and education and the social mobility of the disadvantaged group? Thank you.
Jerry Rogers.
Thank you. Francisco described climate change as an elephant in the room. This is a room which is full of elephants. So my question is whether the panel would agree that the following 2 elephants also need to be addressed. And the first is military expenditure and war, because while once upon a time we had a peace dividend, in recent years military expenditure has been rising again. This is a distortion, this is competing for resources, and that's before we start to talk about the destruction in Ukraine, Gaza, Yemen, and wherever. So that's the first elephant. And the second elephant is the growth of nationalism, which has all sorts of implications, negative implications for human development everywhere. And some of the implications are on migration, the growth of intolerable attitudes to migration and to migrants, although migration should be an important part of any human development strategy. Populist leaders who are undermining democratic solutions. And above all, the weakening of the international system at a time when it desperately needs to be strengthened. It's been gradually weakened over many years. The UN has the legitimacy on human development. It doesn't have the resources. Perhaps that's where Francisco's carbon tax comes in.
Yes. Yes, yes, of course.
I'm Suresh Agarwal, visiting professor at ISD. My question is to Professor Wagle. Very frequently, this concept of HT is interchangeably used with the concept of happiness and individual well-being. So do you think they are really measured the same thing, and in any way are they related to each other? Because very frequently they are used with each other. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I forgot. I'm sorry. I'll come to you next.
N.K. Chaudhary, Patna University. Sir, if I am permitted to exclude your observations.
Please feel free to ask your question.
Sir, please. Because how is it that a discussion on the future of human development in global south and more so in India have no discussion on future of democracy in these areas? As I think, I'm convinced, future of democracy has a huge impact on future of human development. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the policy which the Honorable Chairman is talking about is a reflection of social political philosophy of the government.
I've got your
Number one. Number two, 10 seconds. How is it that very same countries which talk of human rights are the worst violators of human rights even today? How do you explain? Thirdly, is it not the ideology of the panelists which has influenced your responses on this very important subject?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just two quick questions. One to Professor Arite. I'm so happy to see you here, sir. I'm with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and my question really relates to the point that you made about debt. I mean, that is really the biggest problem, the challenge that we are facing in Africa. One point has been mentioned by Jerry Rogers about military spending. So that is one issue that is very important. I mean, we did some work a few years ago, and we looked at military spending as percentage of GDP. In 6 countries in Africa out of 54, it exceeds the public spending on health. In addition, there is a whole issue of illicit financial flows. And in 22 countries, illicit financial flows exceed the health financing gap, which is how much you should spend on health and how much they are actually spending. So in that sense, these are the 2 areas which I think the countries could focus, and this could become a part of national discourse, which is very important. In addition, we have the debt-to-health swaps, which can be used as tools, development impact bonds, which are there, but which need to be scaled up. So those are the areas that one should look at in mobilizing local resources, because we know that tax base is extremely distorted and limited, because most of the taxes come from indirect sources and not direct. My last question really is to my good friend Swarnim. I'm so happy to see you here, Swarnim, and given your past 30 years of engagement with human development, I'm just curious to know that now that you are the member of parliament in Nepal, how are you taking these issues forward? And is there an appetite within the political class in Nepal, which is similar to in India, I'm sure, for discussion on issues of human development? Because otherwise, we are talking in an echo chamber. All of us agree on everything, but how is it translating and moving forward within the political system? Thank you.
Okay. I think for the moment, we'll stop with this set of questions. We inherited a very long time lag, but Thomas Pogge's lecture starts at 5:30, and there is an online audience. So I don't want to overrun too much, but we have 15 minutes for panelists to respond to any question that they wish to. So who would like to begin?
I can deal with the questions about what recommendations to. My understanding of the question was what three things I would recommend to African leaders, right? Yeah. A view that I hear around me in Africa all the time, largely from the middle class, is that there's a very strong leadership deficit in the region. I often extend it to the rest of the world. I mean, there's a strong leadership deficit in the whole world anyway. But leaders in Africa who are very aware of the challenges of their individual countries and are willing to take decisive action to deal with it. And of course, usually they give examples of some leaders that have sort of risen above everybody else and been able to deal with it. The example often given is Rwanda, which is debatable. So leadership is the first thing that needs to be addressed. The second thing is thinking long term. Your average African elected leader thinks only about the next 4 years, winning elections. The challenges of Africa are largely of a structural nature. You can't deal with these within 4 years, or not even 8 years. So the fact that we need to look at governance as an additive process, that somebody comes and does something and leaves. And so, yes, Africa needs to create time for itself to transform. It's not going to happen in the next 20 years. It needs, but there needs to be a framework in which different actors see their roles in that. The third thing that I would recommend to every African leader is to focus on research and innovation. We have the 17 SDGs that everybody's struggling to achieve. There's one thing I tell them when I've had a chance to. There's no way you attain even a half of these things without doing things differently. Doing things differently, whether in agriculture, whether in climate change, whether in health, whatever. Doing things differently requires new research and innovation. And therefore, it's important for governments to think about that. There's not a single African country, apart from South Africa, that spends more than 1% of total GDP on research and innovation. So these are the three things that, for me, will be the most important thing. There's a question about military.
Can I just go around the table?
Sure.
You can come to that. The reason is that what I'd like to do now is to give 3 minutes to each panelist so that we can finish at 10 to 5. Because I'm also thinking of Professor Poge's lecture and online audience. And we would have then consumed our 2 hours and 15 minutes. So, Francisco.
Okay, so very quickly then, the first question on what measures should we have, to find the right place where I took the notes. On what measures should we have on SDG 10 to incorporate some of the things that I've been talking about? I must say I don't remember all the measures that are already in SDG 10 off the top of my head, but the one I would suggest really is the share of total inequality that is inherited. These are measures of inequality of opportunity that we've been working on for a while. At the institute I lead at the LSE, we have a program to compute these. We have about 70 countries where we have them already. They're easy to construct, more or less easy, and so I would love to see them used by the UN. On Jerry's question about other elephants in the room, yeah, I mean, absolutely, I agree. Military expenditure and war in particular are terrible things. They've been growing. There is a interesting dichotomy between how we deal with wars and their consequences depending on whether the people who live in the countries are white or not. I think that Europe's response to the migration issues from the Ukraine, you know, given what happened with Syria just before, was just shameful because these were white, blue-eyed migrants. Nothing against the Ukrainian migrants. I mean, they should be helped, but, you know, the Syrians should have been too. But the other one you mentioned is even more important, and I think perhaps part of the root, part of the cause of the first one, which is the growth of nationalism and authoritarian populism. which links to Deepak's, your earlier question on the crisis of democracy and to the gentleman's point here about democracy. And there I'd like to say, since I have 30 seconds, I think it behooves us all who think about these things to come up with a new paradigm that would offer people an alternative to mainstream sort of, market capitalism as usual, which is not going to complete authoritarian populism. I think the reason authoritarian populism is growing, a few of us were talking about this earlier before, is that there was this convergence in the center of the mainstream parties. But, things are not working, people are not happy, and we don't have a paradigm. We don't. Yeah. We don't have an alternative paradigm to rally people in the way that socialism was. That's, it relates to my point in my very first lecture, which was the policies we're talking about are not enough, but we don't know what other policies to do as a coherent package.
Thomas? Yeah, so two things. I will speak a little bit about military and political power and so on in the lecture tonight. And secondly, on the question of democracy, I think one probably has to think that through in a more complicated way, because I'm not sure there is really a correlation between democracy and development in the way democracy is normally understood. You have the counter example of China, which had tremendous development over the last so many 2-3 decades without being a particularly democratic society. The other thing I would mention here is that the country where I live, the United States, is a paradigm example of a democracy which in many ways is extremely undemocratic. Right? It resembles more a $1, one vote system than a one person, one vote system, with the Supreme Court declaring that giving unlimited amounts of money to a super PAC is an exercise of freedom of speech that Congress may not abridge. So we have to look very carefully. I think the political system is hugely important for development. I agree with that. But we need a more nuanced, more differentiated analysis of different political systems to think about how we can design the system so as to make it maximally supportive of development.
Thank you, Thomas. Bhaskar, Swarnim, and Aziza and Darwara. 3 minutes each, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it really brief. I won't answer all the questions. But let me just pick up on Jerry's two elephants, and I completely agree about both of them. A lot has been said about military expenditure. I'll just reflect a little bit on the growth of nationalism question, because I happen to live in the UK, and the Brexit shock has certainly impacted the UK economy much more profoundly than the COVID shock, and that's a lasting impact. And that's just one reflection. And that was democratically voted for. So it kind of connects with your democracy question and the point, Thomas, you're making, that democracy as conventionally defined is too crude a descriptor of political systems. And I think your broader point that political systems matter for development is absolutely correct. But I think we ease into a description of democracy, which is kind of, it's much more problematic than that. On measurement, I've already said that there are these adjusted wealth measures, which I think would tell us a much better and much more nuanced picture around prosperity and well-being, which maybe might help to actually generate that political momentum for change as well. So I just agree with what you said.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhaskar. Swarnim?
Thank you. Let me attempt 3 questions in 3 minutes. On military expenditures, exactly 30 years ago, the HDR 1994, as Shiv would remember, was on human security. The call there was, 20% of public expenditures on HD priorities, 20% of foreign aid on HD priorities. One of the recommendations was to form an economic security council vis-a-vis the other, and that was in the aftermath of the Cold War having been ended, and reaping all these peace dividends, etc., and then reinvest all that in HD priorities. None of that happened, but still relevant. I think we've often emphasized, the HD wallas have been emphasizing augmenting the size of the public expenditure, right? Tax to GDP ratios, etc. Maybe time has come to look into composition of public expenditures and public expenditure switching, right? Not just military expenditures. The size of perverse subsidies that are highly regressive is also very pervasive, and it takes a lot of political capital to take those on. Number 2, on HD happiness, Mr. Agrawal was asking, it's always been emphasized. I think it's in the 1992 HDR It's one of the annex that was drafted by Meghnad Desai. It says the concept of human development is way much broader than the measure of human development. This was to take on head-on the criticism that, oh, HDI is too narrow and all that. HD as a concept, very philosophical. You look at Amartya Sen's descriptions, what you are able to do, what you are able to be nourished, be educated, be secure, achieve self-respect, etc., and also to lead fulfilling lives, right? That's the kind of language that is there in that overarching concept, the broad concept of HD. Happiness, I've never seen it embedded in that original discourse, but one could extrapolate. The confusion perhaps came from the Bhutanese experiment, right? So they went ahead and did this gross national happiness, but if you unpack what they actually means, it's a conventional measure of development: physical infrastructure, health, education, nutrition. So that inability to articulate in measurable terms happiness, I think, confused. But so leading fulfilling lives is a much sort of nicer concept than happiness, which is. Finally, on democracy, to answer Professor Nair's first question and also Saurabh Sinha's question. Now that I'm an elected MP, this is what I wrestle with in a country like Nepal, right? So there's this old division of democracy into liberal and illiberal democracies, constituting of both the constitutional liberalism, rule of law, separation of powers, fundamental freedoms, and this other branch of periodic elections, right? For, the two converged just 100 years ago. By 1867, the constitutional liberalism was very much at work in the UK, but only 1 in 7 males could vote. So periodic elections came later. They converged, and that's how we conventionally understood development. Now that's breaking again. So periodic elections is equated as liberal democracy. You've forgotten the other part, the constitutional liberalism. So I see institutions completely captured. The role of big money, constitutional bodies are captured, all the regulatory agencies are captured, even parliament is now captured. I sit on the parliament's finance committee in Nepal. The other day we had a vote, 19 members from 5 different parties voted in a way, and I was the lone dissenter. And it was obvious that those 19 had almost been captured, right? So it's fraying, and that's taking a toll on accountability.
Thank you, Swarnim. Azita?
Very quickly, less than 3 minutes. Thank you, Jerry, for having entered that elephant of wars and military expenditure. I had it on my list. I didn't have the time. It's a big elephant, and it doesn't affect only the countries where conflict is taking place, but it spreads very much beyond. And I want to add to that the drag, it's not only on expenditures on human development, but it is also, it creates a securitization of terminology of development and a discourse towards especially the youth that is very much goes against everything that we have been discussing about human development and in particular the youth employment crisis. And it shrinks very vividly. I mean, we have plenty of empirical evidence, the civic space and democratic space for youth political participation.
Thank you. Just before we conclude, I just want to make 3 points as bullets, no more. First, Jerry, you're absolutely correct. There are a large number of elements in the room. I would think of military expenditure as instrumental. The cause and effect runs in both directions, but you're getting wars and conflict at the same time. And I think the rise of nationalisms, resurgent nationalisms. Now, there is a link between resurgent nationalisms and what is happening to political democracy. Democracy is neither necessary nor sufficient for development. But for me, democracy is a prior. A, because it has some implicit self-correcting mechanisms that take time to kick in, and democracy evolves slowly. Look at the US 250 years from the time it became independent, and it is beginning to lose some of that. Look at India, 75 years later, political democracy. We have elections, but the real issue is that there's a connect between the resurgent nationalisms and political democracy, because democracy is no longer a threat from generals or monarchs. It's from those elected by people who undermine the very democracy that elects them. Now, to me, this is a big dilemma. I think of democracy as the only way forward for humankind, and yet outcomes that democracy are producing is most worrisome. Second, or third, my last point, I think we have to sit up and get worried because what is happening to human development and human well-being, in the 21st century, at the end of the first quarter, is worrisome. But what frightens me is the amazing resemblance there is between the world in the mid-2020s and the world in the 1930s. Yeah? And do we have to get there? But this is going to need a collective thinking and wise leadership. I don't see any evidence of that at this moment in the world. So on that pessimistic note, I'd like to bring this to a close. But let me thank our panelists for what I think has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all. And sometime, Francisco, that is correct. If you know nothing about it, it comes out even more exciting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Nice meeting you. And good luck in your parliament.
Francisco, they want a photo. So we have to stand just for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. We will immediately start the closing session. However, tea is served outside. While we prepare the stage, request you to kindly grab your tea and come back in the hall as soon as possible.